So I live in Australia and I heard a crazy story the other day. A bloke was trying to break into someone's home. He climbed onto the roof, kicked in a tile and descended into the crawl space of the roof. And then, as he was attempting to enter the house via the manhole, he fell and badly broke some bones. An ambulance was called for the robber, and then he mounted a lawsuit against the homeowner for not more clearly marking the location of the hatch. Insanity. But it does go to show that whatever occupation you're in, there are dangers. Now, film production is a huge process relying on the services of thousands of people, and sometimes this requires them to do some pretty insane things. Sadly, it doesn't always go well. So today, we're diving into the worst movie set tragedies of all time. Now, just a quick warning, we're going to be talking about some pretty unfortunate and unpleasant occurrences that may be confronting to some viewers. So if you're under 15, just check with your folks before you go any further. Of all of Sean Connery's runs as James Bond, You Only Live Twice is easily the least memorable. Not only does it feature some rather awkward racial profiling, but Connery slumbers through the script before promptly making his first of 3 exits from the lead role at the movie's conclusion. But there are a few things worth talking about in this film. One being that the script was written by Roald Dahl. Yeah, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and so forth. And the second thing is that it features some truly exceptional aerial sequences and photography. You might remember that Bond receives a tiny collapsible plane called Little Nelly. This has actually worked, and being a Bond film, when you see it flying, it generally really is. This of course meant that someone had to be up there to film these sequences. Cue badass cameraman John Jordan. This daredevil was so committed to capturing incredible shots that he would quite literally hang himself out the window of the helicopter, resting his feet on the skids in order to get the best shot and angle. Unfortunately, one particular day whilst filming the Bond sequel, John's penchant for close-ups got him a little too close to a Bell helicopter. Rotor, blade, meet, foot. Though it didn't exactly cut entirely through his leg, it did cause a wound so severe he had to be rushed to hospital where his foot was amputated. Good news though, you don't use your foot to press record, and so Jordan jumped straight back into it. Sadly, this incident had no impact on the cameraman's willingness to take risks, and whilst filming Catch-22 in 1969, it all caught up with him. Once again, Jordan found himself shooting out the open door of a B-22 bomber. Having refused to wear a harness, as it would have impacted his ability to capture the necessary shots, he held on with a single hand whilst operating the heavy camera with the other. Now, when you're up high in an aircraft moving at considerable speed, a vacuum of sorts is created in and around the plane. In a split-second moment, the aircraft Jordan was filming banked too close to the cameraman's B-22. The B-22 pitched sideways, disrupting the vacuum. The pressure grabbed hold of Jordan and sucked him out of the aircraft, propelling him skywards at breakneck pace. Sadly, despite being a camera superman, he couldn't fly and fell to his death. For a man used to filming under immense pressure, it seems he finally had the life sucked out of him. Now, today we're talking about accidents that took place during the filming of a movie. So, we're not going to mention James Dean's final drama Portia Meets Tree, or Oliver Reed's bow out alcohol and badassery, or Heath Ledger's tragic demise in New York after finishing The Dark Knight. These stories, they're for another time. And I'm also not going to dwell on the time that Boris Segal stepped backwards onto the rotors of a landed helicopter whilst filming the TV drama World War III, or the time that a stunt pilot lost control crashing into the ocean never to be recovered whilst Tom Cruise mugged for the camera on Top Gun. Instead, we're going to keep our feet firmly on the ground for the next one. The year is 1954, and producer Howard Hughes has decided to film his next epic, The Conqueror, starring John Wayne and Susan Howard just outside the small town of St. George in the Utah desert. The 220 members of the cast and crew began production and spent several months shooting the picture. Upon wrapping production in the desert, they head back to finish the film in the studio. For the sake of consistency, a large amount of sand was transported from the desert to coat the floor of the movie studio back in Hollywood. Anyway, production wraps, and The Conqueror is released in 1956. It's described as a bomb. Terrible reviews and lackluster box office earn it a place on many worst films of all time lists. But it's not Wayne's thin moustache performance as a Mongolian warrior that's the tragedy. By 1980, over half the cast and crew had died of cancer. Neither Hayward nor Wayne escaped the fate either. As it turned out, the town of St. George, Utah is a mere 160 kilometers away from the Nevada test site, and being filmed in the mid-50s, America was right in the midst of the atomic age. Radioactive dust had been carried by the wind across the desert and coated the small town and its surrounds, making the desert literally radioactive. The cast and crew, having spent months both in the desert and working in its sand in Hollywood, had experienced prolonged exposure. A study in the early 2000s found that the town, even to this day, still registers way too high in radiation. Reportedly, Howard Hughes felt so bad after being the one to have signed off on the production that in the mid-1970s, he spent $12 million buying up every single copy of the film he could so that it could never be shown again. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I'm not going to be mentioning how shocked I was to discover that Richard Griffiths, who played Uncle Dursley in Harry Potter, died in 2013 after heart surgery complications. And I'm not going to tell you about how famous Blues Brother actor John Belushi overdosed during a bender on cocaine and heroin in his Chateau Marmont bungalow. No, we're not mentioning them because they didn't happen on set. But we can't get away without mentioning the most famous movie set accident of all time. March 1993, actor Brandon Lee, son of Bruce Lee, was filming the horror comic book movie The Crow in North Carolina. Now, on any movie set, there is a person solely responsible for the handling of weapons. They are referred to as the weapons master. They procure the weapons, they teach the actors how to use them, and they are the only people on set aside from the actors who are allowed to touch the weapons. This is largely because in most cases, when you see a gun on screen, it is a real gun. Because the weapons master is the sole person able to handle and prepare the weapons, it's meant to ensure there are no mistakes, no accidental loading or the like. So a gun on a movie set then is usually loaded with blanks. Now a blank is live ammunition, only it doesn't feature the steel tip of the bullet. Often it's instead made of cardboard. So in other words, it goes bang, but there's no real projectile for the gunpowder to launch. As such, the gun will kick back, you may get some smoke, but it's fairly safe to point under supervision at the actors if required, and generally speaking, even when blanks are used, lead actors still wear a bulletproof vest under their clothes just to be safe. But let's get back to the film, and let's jump back 2 weeks earlier. A scene is being shot on the set of The Crow where a man was to look down the barrel of a gun as it was being loaded on screen. Now, because blanks don't feature the steel tip, they don't look real, and so, in this case, because the bullet was to be seen on screen, a dummy round, which is a bullet only without any gunpowder, was to be used instead. The scene went off without a hitch, and the weapon was returned to the weapons master, who removed and discarded the dummy round and stored the weapon. Unfortunately, unbeknownst to him, the steel tip of the dummy round had dislodged from the body of the dummy bullet and it got stuck in the barrel of that gun. 2 weeks later, Brandon Lee, who had almost finishing filming the movie, arrived on set. On that day, they were to shoot a scene in which Lee's character is shot. To achieve this effect, Lee was rigged with a squib, which is a little pouch of fake blood mounted to a plate with a small amount of gunpowder on it. The device is strapped to the actor underneath their clothes, and an electrical wire is run from the gunpowder to a trigger button. When pushed, the trigger button sends an electrical current into the gunpowder, causing it to explode. The plate protects the wearer's body, and it directs the explosion outwards. This explosion bursts through both the clothing of the actor and the bag of fake blood, making blood splatter out of what appears to be a hole in the person's chest. When you couple this with the shooter firing a real gun loaded with a blank in the victim's direction, it creates a pretty realistic effect. Unfortunately, on the day of filming, the weapons master on The Crow discovered that he had run out of blanks. No problem, he thought. He had some real rounds of ammunition in his car trunk. He went out and prepared several bullets by removing the steel tip, meaning, just like a blank, the gun would fire, but nothing would come out. At the point of filming, these faux blanks were loaded into the gun, and Brandon Lee, dressed in casual clothes, jet black hair hanging limp down his shoulders, stared down the barrel of the weapon, ready for the director to call action. Action! The villain cocks the weapon, smirks and then pulls the trigger. Bang! The gun recoils as it should. A small tuft of smoke escapes from its barrel. There is a pop as a squib is triggered on Lee's body. He reacts, jarring his body backwards before falling to the ground, blood streaming from the squib device. The director calls cut. The crew clap. An excellent take. Only Lee isn't standing up. He's still writhing on the ground. Now, a second source of blood is adding to the pool. Only this time it's coming from a spot just above his navel. The crew gather around him, and immediately an ambulance is called. 6 hours later, Lee is dead on the operating table. So what had gone wrong? In a perfect storm of misfortune, the same gun that had been used in the scene 2 weeks earlier had been used on this fateful day. The steel tip of the dummy round was still lodged, unseen in the barrel. When the gun was loaded with the converted blank, it had a little more kick than a usual blank. The actor pulled the trigger, the gunpowder in the converted blank exploded, forcing the steel projectile lodged in the barrel out of the gun at immense speed. The projectile entered Lee's abdomen and tore through his organs. In other words, Brandon Lee was shot on camera. The film was ultimately finished using stunt actors with Lee's face superimposed over the top. As to what happened to the tragic footage, it is out there somewhere. Now, we don't have time to talk about Jim Matieros, an outstanding stuntman filming the Disney movie The Rocketeer, when he was propelled out of a car headfirst into a tree. And we'll have to skim over the fact that whilst filming The Passion of the Christ, its assistant director was struck by lightning twice, as was its lead actor Jim Caviezel, with witnesses reporting smoke coming out of his ears. And we're not going to touch on the disturbing scene in The Wizard of Oz, where it appears a small person is seen hanging from a noose in the backdrop of the studio set. We'll also only quickly mention an incident during the filming of the Vin Diesel blockbuster Triple X, where experienced stuntman Harry O'Connor was filming a scene where he had to parasail down a line onto a waiting submarine in Prague. He got it first take. Hearts were racing and high fives were shared, but the eager performer thought he could nail it even better. Sadly, on the second take, he didn't descend quick enough and slammed into a bridge, dying on impact. The first take of the stunt features in the film. We're going to finish today by taking a trip back to 1982. Santa Clarita, California, the cast and crew of Twilight Zone the movie are preparing to film an epic action sequence set in Vietnam. The Indian Dunes Ranch was all set up to stand in for a Vietnamese field. Dense, green shrubbery and forest circled the spot, and as the sun went down, even the dull light was eerily reminiscent of that faraway land. The field was all set. Mortars hidden in the ground were rigged and ready to explode on cue. Extras dressed and waiting, weapons primed, and the actors playing US soldiers jogging on the spot to warm up. In the scene, lead actor Vic Morrow was to carry two small Vietnamese children, Micah Din Lee and Renee Shin Yen Cheng, across the field, whilst being pursued by soldiers in a helicopter. The field was to erupt into a war zone. Explosions ripping up the ground, bullets whizzing past. Chaos was to reign. Everything was prepped, and the director called action. Vic begins running across the field, step by step on the hard earth, the two children balancing in his arms, faster, 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 down the bank towards the river. The mortars begin detonating, explosions all around. The chaos was perfect. Vic focused on running, but from behind him, a sudden deep rumble erupted into a cataclysmic hammering sound. A UH-1 helicopter, large-bodied with a thick black rotor to propel it, came tearing across the field. Vic kept running. The children were getting heavy, but it would be an excellent take. The helicopter is getting louder and louder. He can feel the shift in air pressure, but it keeps moving forward. Suddenly, there is a huge blast somewhere behind him. A mortar. He thinks. He's correct. Erupting out of the ground in a spectacular fireball just as the green helicopter hovers barely 8 meters above it. But something is wrong. The explosion has ripped through the helicopter's tail rotor, causing it to detach from the aircraft. The helicopter jars to the side and begins to spin out of control. The shock causes Vic to drop the young Chen. He quickly goes to pick her up, but it's too late. The out-of-control helicopter is flung over the actors, the rotor instantly decapitating both Vic Morrow and Micah Din Lee. The steel beast then falls the final meters to the ground, landing atop Chen, crushing her. The 6 people aboard the chopper also seriously injured. Tragedy. So what went wrong? It depends on who you ask, but one thing seems certain. Lackluster safety precautions, a hot-headed director who refused to heed the warnings of his crew, and a cavalier attitude towards capturing more and more risky stunts. The pilot of the helicopter was experienced. The crew set up an incredible sequence. The actors hit their marks. It was then, at the end of the day, a lack of communication between the director and pilot that led to the helicopter being in the wrong place at the wrong time, according to the ruling of the National Transportation Safety Board in October of 1984. Well, it hasn't been pleasant, but I have to say, doing this research has taught me 2 things. 1, never go near a helicopter, ever. In fact, just stay away from anything that flies. And 2, if you're a stuntman or a stuntwoman, please strive for mediocrity. Perfection is not worth it. Thanks for watching, folks. Bye.